Hello, and welcome to BookSpot. I'm Earl Weinberg, and this time we will continue our reading of The City and the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. Chapter 5. Our hero Alvin has just encountered a stranger out at the edge of the city where no one ever goes. No one except him, he thought. In his short lifetime, Alvin had met less than 1,000th of the inhabitants of Diaspar. He was not surprised, therefore, that the man confronting him was a stranger. What did surprise him was to meet anyone at all here in this deserted tower, so near the frontier of the unknown. He turned his back on the mirror world and faced the intruder. Before he could speak, the other had addressed him. "You are Alvin, I believe. When I discovered that someone was coming here, I should have guessed it was you." The remark was obviously not intended to give offense. It was simply a statement of fact, and Alvin accepted it as such. He was not surprised to be recognized. Whether he liked it or not, the fact of his uniqueness and its unrevealed potentialities had made him known to everyone in the city. "I am Kedron," continued the stranger, as if that explained everything. "They call me the Jester." Alvin looked blank, and Kedron shrugged his shoulders in mock resignation. "Ah, such is fame. Still, you are young, and there have been no jests in your lifetime. Your ignorance is excused." There was something refreshingly unusual about Kedron. Alvin searched his mind for the meaning of the strange word Jester. It evoked the faintest of memories, but he could not identify it. There were many such titles in the complex social structure of the city, and it took a lifetime to learn them all. "Do you come here often?" Alvin asked, a little jealously. He had grown to regard the Tower of Lorraine as his personal property, and felt slightly annoyed that its marvels were known to anyone else. But had Kedron, he wondered, ever looked out across the desert, or seen the stars sinking down into the west? "No," said Kedron, almost as if answering his unspoken thoughts. "I have never been here before, but it is my pleasure to learn of unusual happenings in the city, and it is a very long time since anyone went to the Tower of Lorraine." Alvin wondered fleetingly how Kedron knew of his earlier visits, but quickly dismissed the matter from his mind. Diaspar was full of eyes and ears and other more subtle sense organs, which kept the city aware of all that was happening within it. Anyone who was sufficiently interested could no doubt find a way of tapping these channels. "Even if it is unusual for anyone to come here," said Alvin, still fencing verbally, "why should you be interested?" "Because in Diaspar," replied Kedron, "the unusual is my prerogative. I had marked you down a long time ago. I knew we should meet someday. After my fashion, I too am unique. Oh, not in the way you are. This is not my first life. I have walked 1,000 times out of the hall of creation, but somewhere back at the beginning I was chosen to be Jester, and there is only one Jester at a time in Diaspar. Many people think that is one too many." There was an irony about Kedron's speech that left Alvin still floundering. It was not the best of manners to ask direct personal questions, but after all, Kedron had raised the subject. "I'm sorry about my ignorance," said Alvin, "but what is a Jester, and what does he do?" "You ask what," replied Kedron, "so I'll start by telling you why. It's a long story, but I think you will be interested." "I'm interested in everything," said Alvin, truthfully enough. "Very well. The men, if they were men, which I sometimes doubt, who designed Diaspar had to solve an incredibly complex problem. Diaspar is not merely a machine, you know. It is a living organism, and an immortal one. We are so accustomed to our society that we can't appreciate how strange it would be and would have seemed to our first ancestors. Here we have a tiny, closed world which never changes except in its minor details, and yet which is perfectly stable, age after age. It has probably lasted longer than the rest of human history. Yet in that history there were, so it is believed, countless thousands of separate cultures and civilizations which endured for a little while and then perished. How did Diaspar achieve its extraordinary stability?" Alvin was surprised that anyone should ask so elementary a question, and his hopes of learning something new began to wane. Through the memory banks, of course, he replied. Diaspar is always composed of the same people, though their actual groupings change as their bodies are created or destroyed. Kedron shook his head. That is only a very small part of the answer. With exactly the same people, you could build many different patterns of society. I can't prove it, and I've no direct evidence of it, but I believe it's true. The designers of the city did not merely fix its population, they fixed the laws governing its behavior. We are scarcely aware that those laws exist, but we obey them. Diaspar is a frozen culture, which cannot change outside of the narrow limits imposed on it. The memory banks store many other things outside the patterns of our bodies and personalities. They store the image of the city itself, holding its every atom rigid against all the changes that time can bring. Look at this pavement. It was laid down millions of years ago, and countless feet have walked upon it. Can you see any sign of wear? Unprotected matter, however adamant, would have been ground to dust ages ago. But as long as there is power to operate the memory banks, and as long as the matrices they contain can still control the patterns of the city, the physical structure of Diaspar will never change. But there have been some changes, protested Alvin. Many buildings have been torn down since the city was built and new ones erected. Of course, but only by discharging the information stored in the memory banks and then setting up new patterns. In any case, I was merely mentioning that as an example of the way the city preserves itself physically. The point I want to make is that in the same way, there are machines in Diaspar that preserve our social structure. They watch for any changes and correct them before they become too great. How do they do it? I don't know. Perhaps by selecting those who emerge from the Hall of Creation. Perhaps by tampering with our personality patterns. We may think we have free will, but can we be certain of that? In any event, the problem was solved. Diaspar has survived and come safely down the ages like a great ship carrying as its cargo all that is left of the human race. It is a tremendous achievement in social engineering, though whether it is worth doing is quite another matter. Stability, however, is not enough. It leads too easily to stagnation and thence to decadence. The designers of the city took elaborate steps to avoid this, though these deserted buildings suggest they did not entirely succeed. I, Kedron the Jester, am part of that plan. A very small part, perhaps. I like to think otherwise, but I can never be sure. And just what is that part? Asked Alvin, still very much in the dark and becoming a little exasperated. Let us say that I introduce calculated amounts of disorder into the city. To explain my operations would be to destroy their effectiveness. Judge me by my deeds, though they are few, rather than by my words, though they are many. Alvin had never before met anyone quite like Kedron. The Jester was a real personality, a character who stood head and shoulders above the general level of uniformity which was typical of Diaspar. Though there seemed no hope of discovering precisely what his duties were and how he carried them out, that was of minor importance. All that mattered, Alvin sensed, was that here was someone to whom he could talk, when there was a gap in the monologue, and who might give him answers to many of the problems that had puzzled him for so long. They went back together down through the corridors of the Tower of Lorraine and emerged beside the deserted moving way. Not until they were once more in the streets did it occur to Alvin that Kedron had never asked him what he had been doing out here at the edge of the unknown. He suspected that Kedron knew, and was interested but not surprised. Something told him that it would be very difficult to surprise Kedron. They exchanged index numbers so that they could call each other whenever they wished. Alvin was anxious to see more of the Jester, though he fancied that his company might prove exhausting if it was too long prolonged. Before they met again, however, he wanted to find what his friends, and particularly Jesserac, could tell him about Kedron. "Until our next meeting," said Kedron, and promptly vanished. Alvin was somewhat annoyed. If you met anyone when they were merely projecting and were not present in the flesh, it was good manners to make that clear from the beginning. It could sometimes put the party who was ignorant of the facts at a considerable disadvantage. Probably Kedron had been quietly at home all this time, wherever his home might be. The number that he had given Alvin would ensure that any message would reach him, but did not reveal where he lived. That, at least, was according to normal custom. You might be free enough with index numbers, but your actual address was something you disclosed only to your intimate friends. As he made his way back into the city, Alvin pondered over all that Kedron had told him about Diaspar and its social organization. It was strange that he had met no one else who had ever seemed dissatisfied with their mode of life. Diaspar and its inhabitants had been designed as part of one master plan. They formed a perfect symbiosis. Throughout their long lives, the people of the city were never bored. Though their world might be a tiny one by the standard of earlier ages, its complexity was overwhelming, its wealth of wonder and treasure beyond calculation. Here, man had gathered all the fruits of his genius, everything that had been saved from the ruin of the past. All the cities that had ever been, so it was said, had given something to Diaspar. Before the coming of the invaders, its name had been known to all the worlds that man had lost. Into the building of Diaspar had gone all the skill, all the artistry of the empire. When the great days were coming to an end, men of genius had remolded the city and given it the machines that made it immortal. Whatever might be forgotten, Diaspar would live and bear the descendants of man safely down the stream of time. They had achieved nothing except survival, and were content with that. There were a million things to occupy their lives between the hour when they came almost full-grown from the hall of creation and the hour when, their bodies scarcely older, they returned to the memory banks of the city. In a world where all men and women possess an intelligence that would once have been the mark of genius, there can be no danger of boredom. The delights of conversation and argument, the intricate formalities of social intercourse, these alone were enough to occupy a goodly portion of a lifetime. Beyond those were the great formal debates when the whole city would listen entranced while its keenest minds met in combat or strove to scale those mountain peaks of philosophy which are never conquered, yet whose challenge never palls. No man or woman was without some absorbing intellectual interest. Ariston, for example, spent much of his time in prolonged soliloquies with the central computer, which virtually ran the city, yet which had leisure for scores of simultaneous discussions with anyone who cared to match their wits against it. For 300 years, Ariston had been trying to construct logical paradoxes which the machine could not resolve. He did not expect to make serious progress before he had used up several lifetimes. Natania's interests were of a more aesthetic nature. She designed and constructed, with the aid of the matter organizers, three-dimensional interlacing patterns of such beautiful complexity that they were really extremely advanced problems in topology. Her work could be seen all over Diaspar, and some of her patterns had been incorporated in the floors of the great halls of choreography, where they were used as the basis for evolving new ballet creations and dance motifs. Such occupations might have seemed arid to those who did not possess the intellect to appreciate their subtleties. Yet there was no one in Diaspar who could not understand something of what Ariston and Natania were trying to do, and did not have some equally consuming interest of their own. Athletics and various sports, including many only rendered possible by the control of gravity, made pleasant the first few centuries of youth. For adventure and the exercise of the imagination, the sagas provided all that anyone could desire. They were the inevitable end product of that striving for realism which began when men started to reproduce moving images and to record sounds, and then to use these techniques to enact scenes from real or imaginary life. In the sagas, the illusion was perfect because all the sense impressions involved were fed directly into the mind, and any conflicting sensations were diverted. The entranced spectator was cut off from reality as long as the adventure lasted. It was as if he lived a dream, yet believed he was awake. In a world of order and stability, which had in its broad outlines not changed for 1,000 million years, it was perhaps not surprising to find an absorbing interest in games of chance. Humanity had always been fascinated by the mystery of the falling dice, the turn of a card, the spin of the pointer. At its lowest level, this interest was based on mere cupidity, and that was an emotion that could have no place in a world where everyone possessed all they could reasonably need. Even when this motive was ruled out, however, the pure intellectual fascination of chance remained to seduce the most sophisticated minds. Machines that behaved in a purely random way, even whose outcomes could never be predicted, no matter how much information one had, from these, philosopher and gambler could derive equal enjoyment. And there still remained, for all men to share, the linked worlds of love and art. Linked because love without art is merely the slaking of desire, and art cannot be enjoyed unless it is approached with love. Men had sought beauty in many forms, in sequences of sound, in lines upon paper, in surfaces of stone, in the movement of the human body, in colors ranged through space. All these media still survived in Diaspar, and down the ages others had been added to them. No one was yet certain if all the possibilities of art had been discovered, or if it had any meaning outside the mind of man. And the same was true of love. Chapter 6. Jester sat motionless within a whirlpool of numbers. The first 1,000 primes, expressed in the binary scale that had been used for all arithmetical operations since electronic computers were invented, marched in order before him. Endless ranks of ones and zeros paraded past, bringing before Jesterac's eyes the complete sequences of all those numbers that possessed no factors except themselves and unity. There was a mystery about the primes that had always fascinated man, and they held his imagination still. Jesterac was no mathematician, though sometimes he liked to believe he was. All he could do was to search among the infinite arrays of primes for special relationships and rules which more talented men might incorporate in general laws. He could find how numbers behaved, but he could not explain why. It was his pleasure to hack his way through the arithmetical jungle, and sometimes he discovered wonders that more skillful explorers had missed. He set up the matrix of all possible integers and started his computer stringing the primes along its surface as beads might be arranged at the intersections of a mesh. Jesterac had done this 100 times before, and it had never taught him anything. But he was fascinated by the way in which the numbers he was studying were scattered, apparently according to no laws, across the spectrum of the integers. He knew the laws of distribution that had already been discovered, but always hoped to discover more. He could scarcely complain about the interruption. If he had wished to remain undisturbed, he should have set his annunciator accordingly. As the gentle chime sounded in his ear, the wall of numbers shivered, the digits blurred together, and Jesterac returned to the world of mere reality. He recognized Kedron at once, and was none too pleased. Jesterac did not care to be disturbed from his ordered way of life, and Kedron represented the unpredictable. However, he greeted his visitor politely and concealed all trace of his mild concern. When two people met for the first time in Diaspar, or even for the 100th, it was customary to spend an hour or so in an exchange of courtesies before getting down to business. If any. Kedron somewhat offended Jesterac by racing through these formalities in a mere 15 minutes, and then saying abruptly, "I'd like to talk with you about Alvin. You're his tutor, I believe?" "That is true," replied Jesterac. "I still see him several times a week, as often as he wishes." "And would you say that he was an apt pupil?" Jesterac thought that over. It was a difficult question to answer. The pupil-tutor relationship was extremely important and was indeed one of the foundations of life in Diaspar. On average, 10,000 new minds came into the city every year. Their previous memories were still latent, and for the first 20 years of their existence, everything around them was fresh and strange. They had to be taught to use the myriad machines and devices which were the background of everyday life, and they had to learn their way through the most complex society man had ever built. Part of this instruction came from the couples chosen to be the parents of the new citizens. The selection was by lot, and the duties were not onerous. Ariston and Etania had devoted no more than a third of their time to Alvin's upbringing, and they had done all that was expected of them. Gesserak's duties were confined to the more formal aspects of Alvin's education. It was assumed that his parents would teach him how to behave in society and introduce him to an ever-widening circle of friends. They were responsible for Alvin's character, Gesserak for his mind. "I find it rather hard to answer your question," Gesserak replied. "Certainly there is nothing wrong with Alvin's intelligence, but many of the things that should concern him seem to be a matter of complete indifference. On the other hand, he shows a morbid curiosity regarding subjects we do not generally discuss." "The world outside Diaspar, for example?" "Yes, but how did you know?" Kedron hesitated for a moment, wondering how far he should take Gesserak into his confidence. He knew that Gesserak was kindly and well-intentioned, but he knew also that he must be bound by the same taboos that controlled everyone in Diaspar. Everyone except Alvin. "I guessed it," he said at last. Gesserak settled down more comfortably in the depths of the chair he had just materialized. This was an interesting situation, and he wanted to analyze it as fully as possible. There was not much he could learn, however, unless Kedron was willing to cooperate. He should have anticipated that Alvin would one day meet the Jester with unpredictable consequences. Kedron was the only other person in the city who could be called eccentric, and even his eccentricity had been planned by the designers of Diaspar. Long ago it had been discovered that without some crime or disorder, utopia soon became unbearably dull. Crime, however, from the nature of things, could not be guaranteed to remain at the optimum level which the social equations demanded. If it was licensed and regulated, it ceased to be crime. The office of Jester was the solution, at first sight naive, yet actually profoundly subtle, which the city's designers had evolved. In all the history of Diaspar, there were less than 200 persons whose mental inheritance fitted them for this peculiar role. They had had certain privileges which protected them from the consequences of their actions, though there had been jesters who'd overstepped the mark and paid the only penalty Diaspar could impose, that of being banished into the future before their current incarnation ended. On rare and unforeseeable occasions, the Jester would turn the city upside down by some prank which might be no more than an elaborate practical joke, or which might be a calculated assault on some currently cherished belief or way of life. All things considered, the name Jester was highly appropriate. There had once been men with very similar duties, operating with the same license in the days when there were courts and kings. "It will help," said Gesserak, "if we are frank with one another. We both know that Alvin is unique, that he has never experienced any earlier life in Diaspar. Perhaps you can guess better than I can the implications of that. I doubt if anything that happens in the city is totally unplanned, so there must be a purpose in his creation. Whether he will achieve that purpose, whatever it is, I do not know. Nor do I know whether it is good or bad. I cannot guess what it is. Suppose it concerns something external to the city." Gesserak smiled patiently. The Jester was having his little joke, as was only to be expected. "I have told him what lies there. He knows that there is nothing outside Diaspar except the desert. Take him there if you can. Perhaps you know a way. When he sees the reality, it may cure the strangeness in his mind." "I think he has already seen it," said Kedron softly, but he said it to himself and not to Gesserak. "I do not believe that Alvin is happy," Gesserak continued. "He has formed no real attachments, and it is hard to see how he can while he still suffers from this obsession. But after all, he is very young. He may grow out of this phase and become part of the pattern of the city." Gesserak was talking to reassure himself. Kedron wondered if he really believed what he was saying. "Tell me, Gesserak," said Kedron abruptly, "does Alvin know that he is not the first unique?" Gesserak looked startled, then a little defiant. "I might have guessed," he said ruefully, "that you would know of that. How many uniques have there been in the whole history of Diaspar? As many as 10? 14, answered Kedron without hesitation, not counting Alvin. You have better information than I can command, said Jesserac wryly. Perhaps you can tell me what happened to those uniques. They disappeared. Thank you. I knew that already. That is why I have told Alvin as little as possible about his predecessors. It would hardly help him in his present mood. Can I rely on your cooperation? For the moment, yes. I want to study him myself. Mysteries have always intrigued me, and there are too few in Diaspar. Besides, I think that fate may be arranging a jest beside which all my efforts will look very modest indeed. In that case, I want to make sure that I am present at its climax. You are rather too fond of talking in riddles, complained Jesserac. Exactly what are you anticipating? I doubt if my guesses will be any better than yours, but I believe this. Neither you nor I nor anyone in Diaspar will be able to stop Alvin when he has decided what he wants to do. We have a very interesting few centuries ahead of us. Jesserac sat motionless for a long time, his mathematics forgotten, after the image of Kedron had faded from sight. A sense of foreboding, the like of which he had never known before, hung heavily upon him. For a fleeting moment he wondered if he should request an audience with the council. But would not that be making a ridiculous fuss about nothing? Perhaps the whole affair was some complicated and obscure jest of Kedron's, though he could not imagine why he had been chosen to be its butt. He thought the matter over carefully, examined the problem from every angle. After a little more than an hour, he made a characteristic decision. He would wait and see. Only 15 uniques in a history of over 1 billion years. Millions of years between them. And they've all disappeared, except Alvin, so far. To be continued.